Good afternoon, everybody. Very nice to see many friendly faces, many friends of Sandra's. So you probably know much more about Sandra than I do as an introduction. But Sandra was one of the first people that welcomed me to Edmonton. So I have very warm memories of that welcome. Thank you, Sandra. Sandra Bromley is a local artist who graduated from the University of Alberta in 1979 and who has gone on to have a very successful and important career as an artist and ambassador for visual art in Edmonton. Not only has Sandra's work been shown nationally and internationally, Sandra has received numerous awards, including the Salute to Excellence Award from the City of Edmonton, a Canadian consortium from the Human Security Fellowship that took her work to Sierra Leone and Cambodia, a Global Woman of Vision Award, and a YWCA Woman of Distinction and the Queen's Jubilee Medal. Sandra Bromley's multidisciplinary interactive art includes traditional sculpture, as well as video, sound, photography, and installation. Since the year 2000, Sandra has focused her studio artistic work on themes of peace and conflict, represented in international exhibits. The most renowned artwork, which continues to be chillingly relevant, is the 5-ton gun sculpture, co-created with Wallace Kendall, which has been seen by over 1.5 million visitors and toured 3 continents. Sandra is also co-founder of the iHuman Youth Society, an arts-based program which serves high-risk youth, and founder of the Sierra Leone Bow Girls Group. So without further ado, please welcome Sandra Bromley.
Okay. Thank you to the organizers, and thanks for the invitation to come and speak. I've actually designed this talk mainly for students, and I noticed that because of the timing and situation, there's only a few students here at the moment, more to come. But so I invite you all, gray hair, black hair, whatever hair, to become students again, and I'll pretend. You pretend. So, as it mentions, my talk is on social change and change agent. It's mainly focused on social works, such as the gun sculpture and the fellowship, with sort of a brief lead-in. So when I left the University of Alberta, I was doing constructivist wood work like many of the students of my time. Shortly after, we moved to London, and at that time, one of the first things I did in London was I approached the head arborist at Kew Gardens and made good friends with him. So for the rest of my 13 years in London, England, I had access to phenomenally large pieces of wood, and I started carving more as opposed to constructing. This one's downtown on 99th Street and Jasper Avenue in a building, Jacob's Ladder. But being in London, the influence of the city, it's the epicenter of information, journalism. You feel things. You feel the Second World War actually happened. And although I was brought up in a family that was discussed politics and current events widely, it wasn't really until I moved to London that the realities of the world and the effects of conflict, war, and other politics really got to me, and it started entering in my work. Here you can see referred to as Revolution and Iron Cross, even though I was still doing mainly formalist work. Then we took a trip to Egypt, and this is an expedition. It might be 100 years old, but it wasn't. We also visited the temples in Egypt, and it's one of the influences that changed my work for another 10 years. So I started doing work. I think one of the things that I loved about the temples was this very extravagant sculptural exteriors, very masculine exteriors. And then when you went further into the temples, you got to more intimate, almost feminine areas with different altar pieces. My first work on these altar works was with the altar plane as you can see, very high up, so the sacred or the mysterious was beyond us. I did a series of work on that. The next series, the altar plane came down to a level almost like a kitchen table, where, as you can see, the symbols and the information is underneath the table plane. That led eventually to a series of suspended altar planes where the information and mystery was both above and beyond and below the plane. At the same time, I was making large-scale work called the colossi, which I renamed the elders, because when I set them up together, there was this incredible energy of wisdom and sort of primal exchange. And it was also the first time I started collaborating. I collaborated with Maria Formolo. She ran a dance group, and for quite a few years I would create the environments, really depending on what kind of work I was doing at the time, and she would create a dance program that worked within them. It was a very exciting and fruitful collaboration. The colossi. And then in '93, we moved back to Edmonton from London. It was a move that was, the reason why we moved mainly was to help our parents. Bob and my parents were aging, and we needed to be here. Within a year and a half, 3 of our parents had died, and a lot of the reasons for coming back to Edmonton seemed to evaporate. For the first time in my life, I felt myself in a position of depression. It was hard to do much. And so it was either, after 6 months, it was either pills or let's try art as therapy. So it's the first time I used my work as a personal therapy. And I created a series of these stelli pieces, which are wayfinders, or they're a map for me to figure out where I was, why I was there, and how to anchor myself to this new world, which was familiar, but yet not familiar after 13 years away. And it worked. They were pieces that weren't too ambitious, they were small, easy to make, and easy to produce a lot of. And they took me to a much more playful type of sculpture making, which in the next 2 pieces you can see with Muse and Astron. But at the same time, I collaborated on my first public artwork with Catherine Burgess, and which was The Big Rock. Big Rock was a wonderful project. We had a great collaborative experience together, and we're very proud of this piece. I've been talking about influences, and I'll be talking about more. I just wanted to show you a very early influence about guns, and I expect I'm about 4 years old right now. Music and guns has somehow merged and played into my world ever since. Another influence was, at this time, Wallace Kendall came into my life. I don't know if you know Wallace. Sadly, he couldn't be here today, but he's a larger-than-life character. And he tracked me down and invited me to collaborate with them on a project for the millennium. He was very focused on social issues, and he wanted to make a millennium piece that really focused on some of the most important world social issues. I was coming from London and still wanting to be global. I was very interested in the world issues, and so we started planning a project together. We brainstormed numerous concepts. My concern would be whatever we did had a global engagement part and a global ownership. He was very concerned that it would be a raw piece of work and would really hit at the gut of issues. So we basically started to play around. We started to dream of future artworks. We eventually settled on the theme of the culture of violence, how in our world today we pass by a lot of issues. We're busy, we don't pay attention, and things can get out of hand unless we actually take direct action. So one thing about Wallace and I is we're not very good at setting boundaries. Neither of us are good at saying, gee, that's impossible, or that's crazy, or how the hell are we going to do that? And so we dreamed, and we brainstormed, and it grew larger and larger and larger. And then we first started off with an idea of actually more like my altar pieces, and Wallace said, why don't we make the tabletop out of guns? We were thinking about using toy guns at the time, which look real, but the idea of real guns really hit me because it would bring, I believe that each object has a certain energy and history to it, so I thought using real weapons would implant a phenomenally visceral energy into it. So we started doing that, playing from that idea. And this is the model we came up with. Now, the first one was a tabletop. This is the second idea. At this time, I started to have a recurring dream. It happened over 3 weeks. The first part was very foggy, very gray, very undefined, but as each night passed, the gun sculpture new ideas started to develop, and by the end of 3 weeks, it was a fully fleshed out, in color, defined artwork, which was basically a cube looking solid from 3 sides with an entry on the 4th side. Now, I told Wallace about this, and oddly enough, he actually did start dreaming the same dream. Only in his dream, there was a shaft of light inside, so we incorporated his ideas too. Now, I don't have a lot of pictures from the planning of the gun sculpture, and it took a lot to make it go, so I'll leave that quote on for a while. So dreaming is one thing, brainstorming is another, and making it real is quite a different thing. First of all, of course, for artists, you think money. This is going to take funding. Where do I get it from? Second of all, you think materials. Now we set ourselves on guns, Canadians, you immediately think, where are we going to get guns? If we were Americans, we could do that. Well, not so. We actually have mountains of guns, but at that time we didn't know it. This process took 5 years. I thought it was going to be a year or 2. In the end, it took 2 years to develop and plan the vision. It took 2 years to create a sports system and raise the money, and then it took a while to get approval from the federal government, and then 1 year to make the sculpture. So when you're working with guns, and you're working on a project like this, there's lots of issues to overcome. There's lots of challenges. I don't think anybody's made a piece like this. You're in new territory, I mean, even to get government approval. When we started, we didn't realize that we would need 5 ministerial sign-offs to do this. So we needed foreign affairs because we were asking for global contributions of weapons. We needed solicitor generals. We needed defense. What other ones? Justice. Anyway, you don't normally phone up a minister and ask him to sign off on a project. Civilians just aren't allowed to collect 10,000 guns, even if they're deactivated, and put them in a studio and start working. So how did we overcome the technical issues? Well, deactivating guns turned out to be a critical issue, because at the time that we were there, it was about $45 a gun to deactivate a gun. So Wallace and I set out, that was our first hurdle, how to deactivate guns cheaply. We did a whole bunch of tests and came up with the plasma cutter, which cuts into a gun, melts the center, but leaves the far side intact, which was great for our purpose of the gun sculpture. In fact, right now the RCMP and armies around Canada use our method to deactivate weapons. So we gave them that. Funding was a real challenge, of course, because just 2 artists. We knew it was going to cost probably $250,000, maybe $500,000 to do. how do you ever do that? We started with in-kind funding, engineering from Stantec, Carrie Steele volunteered to make the frame. The studio, Mary Lemaitre, who just recently passed away, was a huge supporter of ours, and she managed to talk the provincial government into giving us a large studio for free for this peace project. She didn't tell them it was with guns at the time. And then, of course, volunteers. This was a project that I think it was Al Boguski called the most democratic of art projects, because 2 artists couldn't possibly do it alone. So we had volunteers and thousands of hours put into helping us create this project. And then the final piece was a large grant from the Millennium Fund. Wallace and I never thought in a moment that they'd actually buy this idea, because it was just a crazy box of guns that 2 artists from Alberta, which they loved, the idea that we were from Alberta. We do. And it actually still amazes me. When I think of all the challenges and all the hurdles, it's amazing that it all came together, that it did. And it really came together because of other people joining the dream. And this is, engagement is always part of my art practice, or has been for 20 years. And it was really important to share the idea of the dream, and amazingly enough to us, other people sort of joined and jumped on that dream and became passionate and believed in the cause. People like Jim Hayes at the Canadian Firearms Commission, Firearms Center, Justice Minister Anne McClellan, she was key, because we took this crazy little chocolate box looking maquette to her, and she believed that the power of art could change policy, could affect community policy more effectively than anything else. She was the one who introduced us to Lloyd Axworthy in Ottawa, who was Minister of Foreign Affairs, and we flew to Ottawa to meet with them. His department actually did all the political wrangling and maneuvering to get us meetings with every other federal department that we needed. And I can tell you, not everybody was keen on the idea. There's quite a few ministers that just basically said no, and it was pretty impressive, their maneuvering. When we left Ottawa, we had 5 sign-offs. And of course, luck had a huge part, just right timing, right people, just falling into it. So we had our funding, we had people to help us, we had people believing in us, but then it was a point of reckoning. So how do you make the impossible the possible? And also, oh my God, how do we make this thing now? We told everybody of the dream, but how do you actually make it real? So the first question was, we'd been told that we could get weapons and guns, but we really hadn't seen any. So that was the first question that came up, and we had decided we wanted crime and military involved weapons. The other question that hit us really hard was, what if we make this and it's no good? I mean, every artist's worst nightmare, right, is to get a commission or something big and then not be able to face your friends the next day. And this was a big one. This was the biggest and foremost in public that I've ever been involved with. And the responsibility to other people for all their support was really terrifying. It was gratifying, but it was terrifying. But Wallace and I are both travelers, and traveling experience pays off. We've traveled the globe for years at a time. And in the end, you just trust yourself, you jump in, and you basically get ready to roll with whatever is thrown at you. And luckily, it was a mountain of guns that were thrown at us. So getting the guns, Jim Hayes connected us to armed forces and police forces in Canada. Foreign Affairs we had packages made up, and we sent it out to embassies around the world, and the embassies then contacted local governments for support. We were amazed at how many responses we got. The issue of peace, because this is an anti-violence project, the issue of peace was important then and is even more important now. And you always find some inspired soul in the government that jumps on and understands what you're trying to do and goes way beyond regular duty to make it happen. So we started getting word that guns were coming in. In the meantime, it was kind of nail-biting because time was getting short. We had an exhibit booked in at the Edmonton Art Gallery in a year's time, and you can see how empty the studio is. So just to make sure, since it was such a large project and so expensive and technically difficult to do, we started off making a full-size mock-up of shape to make sure that our proportions, the way that the piece would be put together and everything else was as honed and perfect as possible. So we researched a lot too. We actually did a preliminary trip that took us to Belfast, Jerusalem, Palestine, and a few other places, talking to people that had been involved in conflict, trying to understand the world of conflict and the effect of violence on people. We also did a lot of research on the gun lobby. We did a lot of research on the gun industry, and we followed the money. It tells a very powerful story. So by the time we actually started working on the gun sculpture, we were fully aware of many levels of issues of violence and the gun world than we had been before. We also, because Wallace and I ended up deactivating over 4,000 weapons, we also had to become experts in firearms. So we studied, each firearm has to be deactivated slightly differently, and it all has to be to an international standard. So we had to know the ins and outs of every weapon. It was actually really crummy because every time I watched a movie after that, I wouldn't see anything except, oh, look at that, 48 specialist, look at that, whatever. And I spent my time identifying weapons for many years. So the gun sculpture was made in 14 different pieces to slide together like a puzzle. It was quite tricky to do. As you can see here, so it took a lot of time to make sure that it looked solid. It was really essential to make it look the weight of the world, really heavy, really solid, like a solid cube from 3 sides. You can see the inside was very Spartan and bare. You can see how the panels fit together in there. The floor, somebody said it looked like an archaeological dig. It was 38 specials that we had taken to a forge and flattened and then set into concrete tiles. Cool. When we first started making the work, it was quite interesting because we were formally trained, and the first panel we laid down on the ground, and each of us were doing our own work, and they came out really beautiful. It was really, really beautiful. Guns can be very beautiful. They're fine craftsmanship, many of them. And it looked more like a Scottish castle armory where you have this display that glamorizes the weapons. So we had to really tax ourselves and figure out how we were going to do this. We couldn't work in our previously art school training, and so we had to shake free of our past way of thinking, and we had to react more directly to the energy, the history, and the anger that was embedded in most of these weapons. It was also interesting to collaborate because Wallace and I are very different characters. And we have our own way of doing things. And how do you do something so visceral and strong and that's so complete in itself and yet work with another person? And we ended up devising a system where we would each work on an individual wall ourselves. And then at the end of the day, we'd crit each other for about an hour. And we'd say what works, what doesn't work, make suggestions for each other. And it actually turned into a really productive and relatively seamless approach. Now, this is a big project, and with big projects, especially when you're dealing with materials such as weapons and you're dealing with governments and you're dealing with everything else. It's not the average art project. And so this project was peppered with major dramas. And some of them serious, some of them very funny, but I'll just give you a couple. I could spend the entire talk on crazies that happened to us during this. But we took the gun sculpture to the United Nations in New York City. And we had been shipping it around the world to different events with minimum problems with customs. And we couldn't get it into the United States. Bush was in power at the time, and they just basically said, no, you're not getting it through. One customs agent told me if I had a crate of Glocks, new Glocks, I could bring it in a day. But since we had a gun sculpture, we couldn't. So I phoned up my contacts at the Government of Canada and said, we have a big problem, because it was going to be the feature exhibit for a very large treaty against small arms smuggling, and the days were ticking down. And so in the end, after a lot of trying to work with the United States government, the Canadian government ended up sending a diplomat to the border. He jumped on the truck and declared the entire truck a diplomatic bag and drove it to the United Nations. We set it up with hours, minutes to spare, and then it got packed up a few days before 9/11, and again the diplomat came, drove with it to the borders, and said goodbye to the diplomatic bag. The other thing that was a little bit more serious, but I'm living to tell the story, so not too serious, was all of the weapons were guns, bullets, everything were inspected at least 3 to 4 times by either the RCMP, police, or some other experts. But occasionally little bits got through. So I was welding a bandolier of bullets to the front of the gun sculpture at one point, and they were live. So they started just like in the Westerns, and we all hit the deck really fast. And I'm happy to say they missed us all. So, but it just shows you, no matter how thorough you are, things can happen. So these are just different pictures of the gun sculptures. That's those are mortars on the side. A variety of guns and weapons. That's the front entrance. I think this one's in Vienna. You can see the red part is an anti-tank mine that NATO gave us. And the knife below it is from Cancun, Mexico. Now, an interesting thing, when you're working with a lot of weapons, you start understanding the relationship between people and weapons. And a lot of the handguns were customized, like you can see the cross-hatching on that one. We also found little guns like the center that were made for purses. And we found quite a few that had pearlized handles. What we discovered is that you can actually interchange the handles on your small weapon to match your purse or your outfit of the night. Because who would want to go with pearlized blue if you were wearing pink? So it tells, there's many stories embedded in this material. This is an Aryan symbol from a gang in Montreal. Sawed-off shotgun. Buried under here is a M16 assault rifle from Los Angeles Police Department that was smuggled into Canada. And an interesting thing happened when we were making the gun sculpture. We had no idea what material we were going to get. We had a vague idea, but we didn't know exactly what we were going to get. And so we couldn't pre-plan anything. It was very reactive and instinctive to work on. But what did happen is each wall of the sculpture started to take on its own character. For instance, this wall is, we always called it the military wall. It was like a march, a military march. The other side, opposite side, was more domestic in nature. The back side, I just called it the ugly wall because it was filled with weapons that had been used in the most violent crimes. And I was sick for about 2 months trying to make this work, because every time I touched one of these weapons, the grief, I still feel it, the grief was so tangible and extreme, it would hurt. But it had to be done, so you do it. About a third of the way into the gun sculpture, we realized it wasn't enough, that it was a strong statement of the history of weapons, of the damage of weapons, but we needed a voice, and we needed also a reflection of the present loss or waste. So we decided to do a victims mural. Keeping with the idea of the global aspect, the universal theme, we sent out a call to victim groups and families around the world to share images, images that showed the life of their loved ones that had been involved in violence. And we received 114 in the end. This is, when we started doing this, is many years ago, 2000, and talking about victimization, and that wasn't such a big issue, but instinctively we knew that one thing we didn't want to do is re-victimize the victims by using their images. And we didn't quite know if we were going to do that or not. We had no idea how this was going to be taken or how sensitivity. So we were talking to a few people about this, trying to get some kind of guidance, and a friend of ours knew quite a few of the mothers from the Polytechnic massacre, the mothers, the Polytechnic girls. And we were heading to Ottawa anyway, and he arranged for us to have dinner with 4 of them. And so we basically told our story, and we said, we won't do it if it's not right. Like, it would be awful for us to make this whole installation and fail on this one part or abuse it. And they, at the end of the meal, they answered by coming over and hugging us. And they said, if anyone shares the image, they want the loss of their loved ones to actually be active, to change something, to do something. And they were some of our biggest supporters. So ever since then, I've used their wisdom and guidance as my guiding light. This is just some of the victims of violence on our piece. I got to know, I worked very, very strong on the victims mural myself, along with volunteers, and I got to know most of the families and most of the faces and most of the people involved, but I could never, ever remember the Dunblane, Scotland victims, because I had 2 children and it was just too close to home. I could never go there. It's little Johnny here. The victims mural has appeared in, it's a really, really important part of the gun sculpture, and it's appeared in many different forms. It's appeared in paper, it's been projected onto banners, it's been on vinyl, and the latest is printed on Lexan and backlit. So it really reacts. This sculpture was made for museums and art galleries, but it was also made for wherever people wanted to put it. It was a very public, considered a public work of art, so if there was a warehouse or a tent or wherever people could see it, it was made to go there. So we've been quite flexible in how we approach it. I just came back from Argentina, visiting Liz Ingram and Bern Hildegard, and we visited a memorial for the missing, and I realized when I was walking down these unending lists of names that one of our victims on the mural, Martin, also appeared in their list. He was kidnapped and disappeared at the age of 21. So the other component of the gun sculpture is the Blackboard. Now, we didn't think about this until the first exhibit. It was at the Edmonton Art Gallery, now the AGA, and we had no idea how people would react to the gun sculpture. We knew that it was powerful, but what we didn't realize is that people needed to give back. They needed to be a part of the work, more than just sort of a passive engagement. they needed to contribute, and they were lining up for hours with the comment book. So I think it was Clint at the Edmonton Art Gallery. I think he suggested we could put a blackboard up. So we tried it. We put a full wall blackboard. People spent hours. They drew pictures, they wrote poetry, they left comments. It was incredible. And so what we've done ever since is we've asked each venue to document, photograph the comments before they erase the blackboards. Blackboards are very interesting because people can, they're not permanent, so people feel very free to contribute, and it's a momentary but important statement. You also get dialogue with the commentary. Somebody writes something and somebody answers, whether it's negative, positive, angry, and it's a real, it's very active. Blackboards are a very active form of communication. So we now have over 170,000 comments documented. In parallel to making the gun sculpture, we had a youth group in our studio. Wallace and I had done some Millennium projects with kids, mainly inner city kids and reserves. And they heard about this global anti-violence project and wanted to be a part of it. We didn't think it was appropriate for them to actually work with the guns. Many of them had social justice issues. But we thought it was really important that they have a voice. So we challenged them to make their own anti-violence project from a youth perspective, and we offered to mentor them. We had a large room in the building. It was our coffee room. We gave it over to the kids, and they did one of the most amazing projects called the Red Tear. Powerful, powerful direct work. It showed at the Edmonton Art Gallery, in a large gallery right beside the gun sculpture, and it was good. So at the end of our gun sculpture project, we said to the kids, "Wow, that was fantastic! What a blast that was!" And we'll see you around, because we had to close up the studio, and it was time to get back to our own lives. We'd lived this beast for long enough. And the kids said no. And we went, "What do you mean no?" And they said, "No, it's way too good. You gotta find us a place. We don't want to shut this thing down." So luckily the Works had a building. I asked around. The Works had a building open for 6 months, and we said, "Okay, we'll keep it ticking for 6 months." And it was all volunteer, open 24/7. All art volunteers, singers, dancers, musicians, artists from all over Edmonton just went there, and we worked with the kids. And this is our first building. And that's me with the red hat. The artwork was good that came out of iHuman. You always get some really, really fantastic creative artists. And iHuman now is this vibrant, amazing organization. I'm still involved. I'm president of the board of directors right now. But it's just incredible. It's grown into this fantastic, real cornerstone organization for vulnerable youth in Edmonton. And the heart is still the arts. It wouldn't exist without the journey of the artistic endeavor. But right at this time, in the first couple of years, Romeo Dallaire, we got to meet him at the United Nations in New York. He actually gave the opening speech for the gun sculpture exhibit there. And he was passing through town, invited us for breakfast, and Wallace and I joined him. And at that time, he suggested that I should apply for a fellowship. The Canadian Consortium for Human Security, it's spread throughout universities across Canada. And it was the first year they opened it up to non-academic staff. So I applied, and I received the first artist support fellowship, which allowed me to work on a project for a year. It was women and children in post-conflict countries, both research and making artwork about it. And I joined forces. This is Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone I chose because it was only 6 months out of conflict. It was still very raw. Infrastructure was completely destroyed there, and everything was very on the surface to experience. The other country I chose was Cambodia. It was 10 years post-war. So this is Father Momo in orange, a fantastic people's priest. He'd walk into a village and the first thing he'd do is dance with everybody. So you had to dance with him, whether you wanted to or not, and he was just the coolest and kindest person and really helped me with my project. Mr. Abu, translator and cultural guide for me, he worked hand in hand with Father Momo, and they were the ones who introduced me to child soldiers. They had set up a program called CAW, Children Affected by War, years before, and they were the first group in the world to try and reintegrate child soldiers back into the community. So they had trust involved with all these young people, and I was brought into that trust circle. And so the ones who wanted to share their story were introduced to me. Kamara was the first person, and I have to say his interview changed my life again. I had prepared and researched and studied a lot for the countries I visited, read many, many of the books about the horrors that took place to prepare myself, and nothing could prepare me for the story he told me. The inhumanity involved, and what I started to understand is the blurred lines between perpetrator and victim. Kamara taught me everything in that. They also took me, Father Momo and Mr. Abu took me to visit many child workers because that's one of the effects of war. There's no economy, everybody works if they can. These little guys work from 8 years old on long days in the diamond mine. The last group we visited was a Bow Girls group, and Kadir, second from the end, standing up, again, changed my life. I interviewed all the girls. They were a wonderful group of girls. They had had 6 months of funding to do a small group work, just a group, meeting as a group. They were all bushwives. Bushwives are either sex slaves or labor slaves, usually both, during the war. Child soldiers sometimes take one, sometimes they're just shared around. All of the girls had children from their experiences. When they came back to Sierra Leone, to their communities, they were shunned because they were not married. So these girls were at the bottom of the heap. That happens in war. Women and children are the most vulnerable and the least taken care of. Young men are considered dangerous, so there's lots of money poured into rehabilitating young men and getting them back into the community. The girls who are affected are left on their own. Anyway, at the end of Kadir's interview with me, she was the last one I interviewed, she just simply said, you know, can you help us help ourselves? And I knew I had to do something in Sierra Leone because of the privileged position we have here. So it turned out to be a commitment to fundraise so that the girls could receive training to help themselves, to educate their children, that was priority, and to find some level of respect in the community. And so my friends and I all gathered, many who are here today, and we supported them through that process. Kadir has appeared in many, many of my artworks. She still speaks to me strongly. The other thing that was challenging at the time, but odd, and I didn't understand it at the time, is that I made an awful lot of bad artwork at this time. I'm a responsible person, and my responsibility to the fellowship was to research and produce artwork. So I produced artwork, and I never was happy with it, and it always felt empty. And that happened for about 2 years, and I was deeply uncomfortable that I couldn't complete my commitment. But what I found out is you can be traumatized. Even if you're not directly involved, you can be traumatized from the stories. And the stories I heard were so much worse than anything I had read and so tragic for these young people to have experienced that I could not face being vulnerable and truthful and doing my artwork at the time. And I think, especially for social art and engagement work, you have to be vulnerable yourself and you have to be truthful, or it's obvious. So it took about 2 years or so after where I finally, and I didn't know it at the time, but I finally started producing work that I thought was honest and respectful of the people I met. This is Innocent. It's a variable exhibition. It's up to 12 light boxes, and depending on the space, it cuts down or goes up. There's a chain that connects all the stripped FN rifles. Those were left over from the gun sculpture. I'm still using the material. And then light boxes and photographs. I try to be a witness. I don't try to manipulate or alter or add to what the people I interviewed gave to me. Along with Innocent, the four doors show many times in conjunction with it. The four doors are, as you can see, an open framework with doors on either side. There's Kamara, who you saw in the first, he's the first child soldier I interviewed. Celia. Celia sought me out. We were on a small island. She sought me out because she really wanted the world to hear her story. This exhibit is one about invitation. You can either stand and look at the exterior of the doors, and that's all you take, or if you want to actually commit or consider or engage, you can open the doors, and that triggers a video on the small little old school TVs at the back, and it's a video that I took of the interview. I don't translate it, I don't alter it, I let the voices speak for themselves. When you close the door, the video goes off, so it's up to the visitor how engaged they want to be. I transferred photography, imagery onto the doors, and then scratched and drew into it. Cambodia. This is at the Killing Fields Museum. My project in Cambodia consisted of basically randomly meeting women. It's 10 years since the conflict, so everybody had grown up. So I met women and chatted with them, had a translator, and I asked them to tell me their stories, and they did. And at the end of that, and there was a lot of laughter and there was a lot of tears. They were very generous. At the end of that, I asked them if they would please give me something that they owned, something old, something not valuable. And they would give me either completely worn up flip-flops or that they were still using. Or one gave me a sieve that they used the rice to get the shaft up, and it had holes all through it, but she was still using it. And I would take those to the local market, and I would buy exactly the same thing and bring it back and regift it to them. And they would laugh their heads off at the idea that I got the bad end of the stick. But those objects were important to future artworks. So a lot of artwork came out of that series that wasn't just the fellowship work. Using, as you can see, a gun from the gun sculpture material and imagery from the fellowship material. I also react strongly to governments and government policies, and when Harper brought in the omnibus C-10 bill, I could not stop myself from producing an awful lot of work in the studio on that. It had a really difficult effect on our I-Human youth. So I do a series of work on that. What I realized is a few years ago that I again had a recurring dream, and that recurring dream was about walking in a forest of bells. And again, it happened over 2 weeks, and it was foggy and vague at the beginning. And by the end, I was walking through this beautiful forest of bells, and there was sound, and there was light, and there was smell, and it was amazing. And I realized shortly after that it was healing, and that I needed to heal. I'd worked so hard on all these projects, and it was slowly and surely wearing me down, and the joy of life was not as easy to come by. And so I was self-healing, subconscious was self-healing. And then I realized that I have to follow that. Whenever I have dreams that last more than a week, I have to follow them, and I have to make them. So I started working on a series of works around the concept of the forest or the wave, or they were based on a lot of different big ideas of bells and environments. There's video in there, there's sound in it. And I started realizing that if I'm feeling this way, it's probably a thing that most of us are feeling right now. I think there's so many crises in the world. It's so stressful, it's so uncertain that I kind of think it's time that we do some artwork that heals. I've completely forgotten my list now. I'm just going to take a minute to take a look. So I'm almost at the end. I don't know how the timing is. Yeah. So I thought I'd just show you a few public artworks as well. It's a funny thing that when I was doing all these works, I didn't, when I was working at iHuman and when I was doing the fellowship work, and they all seemed kind of disjointed and not together. What I didn't realize, and the same with the public works, and I thought, well, that's just me, I just react and do them. But what I've realized over time, and that's what age gives you, is you're able to look back and realize that it's all been about engagement. Almost everything I've done, I need to engage in some fashion or another with the community. So this is a mural that I did quite a long time ago, 100 portraits. Half of them I photographed myself, the other half I invited people to look through photo albums, and I researched archival material. It's on the AFA wall. It was a Centennial Commission. It's another part too. It's DuPont film embedded in glass through a heat process. This was just a recent one. Bequest was, I've never done a time capsule before, but this is it. And it's using local sandstone from a farmer's field, elm wood in the middle, and then stainless steel box. It's sealed, archivally sealed for the time capsule archival material. That's at St. Albert. And the latest one was Sentinel, which took me across Canada, meeting people, discovering sources of rock, and it's a different rock from every province and territory in Canada, and that was an incredible project to get to know so many people around our country. And that's it.
Questions?
Sure. I have one thing that I wrote here, and I probably said it already, but I'll throw it in because what I wrote was I have 3 major passions in life. I think I just spoke about that, but one's my family. My husband's here. Children are all over the world. My art making is really a core part of me, and iHuman is another core part. At times I didn't understand how they fit together, as I mentioned, but as time went on I realized they're from the same core of creative energy and direction. And I feel no separation between any of the things I do now. They are all a part of me. Thanks. Any questions? Anybody has any? No. It's not that serious. Oh, you're good.
No, well, it's a very open question. What's next?
Oh, gosh, I don't know. You know, I'm working on some things in the studio for sure. I'm working on a lot of transfers. For the last couple of years, I've done commissions, so I've only been working on smaller works. I have a series of 100 images of people from around the world that I meet, and it's cumulative. It's growing all the time. That's a wall, and quite a few other small works. But I've never planned my life. You know, I always wait for something to happen, and it always happens. And I have things to do in the meantime, but something else is going to take me. So I just trust that life's filled with interest. But yeah, right now it's smaller works in the studio. They're flat. Well, they're sort of flat. They're on wood. And now they're turning three-dimensional. That's all I can tell you, because I'm in process right now.
So what, after making such a monumental sculpture like that, do you find it hard to go back to the studio on your own? Also working collaboratively with somebody and then have to then go back and make work on your own? Or did it happen and you got the next project?
Well, no, I've always been an introvert in the studio, extrovert out of it, introvert in, and I've always been very precious and protective of my time. So it was actually very difficult for me to collaborate with Wallace because we spent 10, 12 hours a day together. So I had to teach myself how to do that. And returning back to the quiet was easier than the opposite way. Although I did kind of miss the juice, you know, the excitement of it all. But really, I was exhausted after the gun sculpture. The last year was 7 days a week, no holidays, 12-hour days, and just to get it done because timing was really critical. So it took me almost a year to recover, so I did smaller work at that time. And then the fellowship started, so it just took me. The fellowship really came out of working on the victims mural, because at the end of the gun sculpture, I always felt that I hadn't done enough for the victims. I always felt like there was unfinished business there, in that I hadn't delved deep enough into it. So the fellowship really filled that gap for me and created a pathway that I could fulfill what I felt I needed to do. So no, it was kind of easy to go back to my nice quiet studio.
Where is the gun sculpture?
Sadly, it's in storage right now.
Where
We have storage. Sculptors are always interested in storage. We have a company that sponsors storage for us. So they store it in their warehouse. It's in Nisku. So, but they don't let me store anything else in there, Lyndall. Lyndall has the best storage space in the world, and we're all jealous of her. So. No, my studio's packed right now, so no. We were hoping to get it into the States, and we're still hoping on that, but climate there is not very conducive.
would you like to have it in some permanent location?
Yeah,
And hopefully indoors somewhere.
it has to be
Has
indoors,
to be
yeah.
indoors.
Yeah, it won't rust, although that's a statement in itself, so you never know. But yeah, we would like to do that, and that's, you know, when one has time or focus, that's a thing that we'll have to do. But I still think right now, I think it's more important than ever. I think the message is so critical right now with what's going on. And it's a phenomenal piece for creating dialogue. It just does. Whatever country, whatever culture you take it into, it's an activism piece. and it gets people looking at the critical issues, and it gets them talking about them. So it's sort of separate from me now. You know, when you make a piece and there's enough time, it's like it's a separate soul or a separate entity. So I sort of look at it from afar and go, whoa, you know, but it's a workhorse. It's a workhorse sculpture, and it should be out doing its work. So it's sad to me that it's stuck in storage at this particular time.
Has the Forest of Elves been here?
It has shown here, yeah.
We'll get to see it again.
Hopefully. Well, there's quite a few of them. There's a wave, and but yeah, I don't know if they'll show in Edmonton or not, but hopefully.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that? Do we get to walk through it when it's installed?
Yes, it's fully active, and I really enjoy it. Of course, you really enjoy seeing how people react with your work, but when it was here in Edmonton, people would walk through and their personalities would show up as they walked through. Like some would try not to touch any of the strings and ring the bells, so they'd be like this, moving through, and others would, you know, and the whole bells would be tangled, which I loved, because it showed the pathway that the person walked through. It showed the personality.
Leave it tangled or untangled?
Well, the staff at the venue would constantly untangle it, but I developed a piece called Tangle right after that, which meant go for it and don't touch it after, and then it becomes a completed piece through everything else. The bells have great legs. They can change and move and be set up in all sorts of variety of combinations, and different videos, sound can create a completely different environment.
Can I ask another
Sure.
question? So you were trained very formally in sculpture here. Yeah, and do you still feel that influences your work even now?
Oh, I'm really grateful to the formal training because composition, relationship, textures, all this. I mean, I really believe when I start out with a piece, that visual concern is really critical to me making a successful piece of work. It's got to be visually strong, but that's only just one component of the art making for me now. I look at a piece and I think it has to hit you visually, sensually, spiritually, and emotionally. If I can hit all of those 4 points and embed that in my artwork, then I think it has a separate soul and it's successful. If I miss any of them, which you do all the time, you know, it's an okay work of art, probably fine, but it's not the ones that sing or last or that you go back to nourish you all the time. So no, the formal training I think was really essential because I'm always concerned on those sensual and visual elements in the piece, but they're a lovely building block of the whole. Yeah?
You mentioned a period when you were making work that you were not very happy with, and it sounds like the resolution for you was being more vulnerable. Can you talk about either of those things?
Well, yeah, because I didn't know I was traumatized, first of all. I felt I was a witness, not doing anything that these kids had done. And so I didn't understand the damage that had happened to myself. And I just plowed through as if it hadn't happened because I didn't understand it. When you hide from all those things, you almost make a veneer or a pastiche. You only use your intellect because that's what you can handle and that's what protects you. So you're intellectually working on all these things. And you know, having experience and being around for a long time, I know how to intellectually make a piece that should be successful. But it's not art. It doesn't have a... I mean, I always look and think it's a soul.
Yeah,
When it sings by
what
itself.
you just said about those four
Yeah.
different things.
And it was frustrating because I felt I was making veneers or pastiches of a very serious subject. And it was just simply like a lot of things in life, it was process, allowing myself to process, not be too hard on myself if I could not. And then when I was strong enough, it naturally happened that I could go back and sort of relive those moments and try to translate what the people gave to me in their interviews into some sort of communication and honoring or respecting of them in the work and the issues I was trying to put forward, which is about us and them and victim perpetrator, the blurred lines. So yeah, I don't think you consciously know it. It's always looking back that you can understand how these things work. But I think for social art, you can't be an outsider. You know, you can't be a fly on the wall. You have to, if you're going to engage and comment and be active, you have to be part of that. And you have to understand the issues. So that's what I meant by that. But it's very frustrating to know what good art is and know that you're really not doing it. You know, it's just, and to have expectations and exhibits lined up to show the work when you don't think it's good enough to show. Like, those are really interesting things that most people face at some time or another, but I hadn't before that. So, it's embarrassing too.
If there are no more questions? Yeah? Yeah, well,
I'll do
Marilene's
it
got all of the
later.
questions.
I'll do it later.
All right, so if there are no more questions, we can just give one last big round of applause.